All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming today and welcome to the people on Zoom. I am pleased to welcome our guest speaker today, Major Padre Andrew Cameron. Has been serving as a Padre with the Canadian Forces. He started his career as an infantryman with 3 PPCLI, and about 10 years in found a different calling and went to do his master's in divinity, and has been serving as a chaplain with the Canadian military since 2013. And so without further ado, welcome Andrew.
Well, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here and spend some time with you. So I'd like to begin with a story. On the night of April 17th, 2002, at a place called Tarnak Farms, which was about 7 kilometers from the Kandahar airfield in Afghanistan, the para company from the Third Battalion was conducting a nighttime live fire exercise. And during this exercise, 2 American pilots flying F-16s, well, they dropped a 500-pound bomb on our location after mistakenly believing that we were enemy Taliban. 4 soldiers were instantly killed, and another 8 soldiers were injured. I was there that night as an infantryman. I was a corporal at the time, and I was very close to the target point where the bomb hit. In the aftermath, the nation was plunged into mourning and shock because the first 4 deaths of the Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan were due to a friendly fire incident. Now, needless to say, it was a hard time for the soldiers of the 3rd in the days that followed because, we still had to do our jobs while trying to find time to mourn. And eventually we had a ramp ceremony. And if anyone has ever seen that on television, what it is a memorial off the back of a plane. The soldiers escort the bodies of the fallen onto the plane, and they accompany the bodies back to Canada. I'll never forget that. The entire base turned out for this event. There was thousands of soldiers representing, all sorts of different countries. We were traumatized as a group by this experience. Now, recently, I was actually in Edmonton back in April, and I attended the 20th anniversary of Operation Apollo, and I had a chance to talk with a lot of people that were on the tour with me. And it was obvious to me that there are still some carrying around wounds from that night. They carry burdens they can't lay down, and many of them compounded those wounds by going back to Afghanistan again, and sometimes multiple times, and experiencing additional trauma. Now, I'm not a psychologist, I'm a pastor and a soldier, but it seems that war experience and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, they go hand in hand. However, not every soldier develops PTSD as a result of their experiences. And so I thought about that for a long time. Why this is. Why is it that 2 soldiers who are impacted by the same event or events be moved towards different outcomes, where one develops PTSD and the other one does not? I had a suspicion that I held a partial answer to my question. And as the years have gone by, it's been borne out by research, and it's this: spirituality is a protective factor to our well-being. I'll say that again. Spirituality is a protective factor to our well-being. Now, before diving any deeper into this, I want to get this out of the way right away. A protective factor is not an invincible shield. Having spiritual practices doesn't make us immune to trauma. It does help, however, a lot. Now, as a chaplain, I've taught spiritual resilience to recruits at the Canadian Leadership and Recruit School, CFLRS, as part of their training. And that's the training base located in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu. And I would talk to the recruits and the officer cadets, and I explained to them about the 4 domains in our lives. You have the physical domain, the emotional domain, the mental, and the spiritual. That's usually how life is conceptualized. And I'd use the image of 4 squares. And these 4 squares can overlap. And they overlap when we engage in healthy practices in each domain. For example, when we're in good physical health, when we're emotionally stable, when we're mentally well, and we practice good spiritual hygiene, well, when that's all there, we're optimized. there's coherence, there's unity, there's soundness in our lives. So the domain I want to talk to you about today is spiritual resilience. Okay, well, let's define that. What is spiritual resilience? We've used a couple of different terms over the years. We used one at the recruit school. I've read a number of different books on spiritual resilience, or just resilience in generality. And I found a really good definition from a research paper entitled Spiritual Resilience, Understanding the Protection and Promotion of Well-Being in Later Life. And that paper can be found at the US government website or the National Library of Medicine. So here's this definition. It says, spiritual resilience is the ability to sustain one's sense of self and purpose through a set of beliefs, principles, or values while encountering adversity, stress, and trauma by using internal and external resources. Internal and external spiritual resources. That's the key word. All right. Okay, so great definition, but why is this important? What's the point? Now, again, I'll use the paper's definition. It says, benefits of maintaining a spiritual well-being often include positive, healthy outcomes, discovering meaning and purpose in their lives, and facilitating coping mechanisms. So, in a nutshell, practicing spirituality will improve your overall resilience to trauma and improves your quality of life and your well-being. There's increasing recognition that people are spiritual, even if they're not particularly religious. Now, if spirituality has been identified as a protective factor, why does it seem like many people don't engage in spiritual practices in order to nourish any kind of spirituality? It's a good question. And I would argue that culture's played a large part there. I believe it's because we live in a postmodern, materialistic culture, and we've lost our sense of the transcendent. We look for options in which to ground our reason for being, but we're not left with a lot of choices. And a lot of people choose nihilism, which is the rejection of all religious and moral principles, the belief that life is meaningless. It's frequently the default option. And even if we don't explicitly state it, we often live our lives like this. I like to use this analogy. We're in a boat and we're surrounded by water. With a little bit of wind and a little bit of wave, it can seem a little worrisome, especially if you're in a small boat, but you'll be okay. But if the water gets into your boat, if the storm picks up, if the wind picks up, well, you're going to be in trouble because the boat will flounder and, well, obviously you could drown. So in the same way, we're surrounded by messages aimed at us about how to live and how to have our being that are not necessarily good for us. And too many unhealthy messages seeping into us or overflowing the boat, we risk drowning in hopelessness and despair, and hence nihilism. I recently heard someone quip that Star Wars is religion for atheist nerds. I think there's some truth to that, because Star Wars has developed a belief system. They have mystical warriors, the Jedi, who wield a mysterious power called the Force. And it seems to me that seeking awe and wonder is an innate desire in people. We seek meaning and wonder in order to fill that God-sized hole in our hearts, because I believe that we're wired to believe in something bigger than ourselves. It's something we still need to experience, regardless of how sophisticated we moderns think we are. Without any spirituality, we're simply trying to fill that hole with other things. I think of the explosion of Marvel superhero movies, and there are a lot of them out there now. And it's a good example of that. There are these heroes, you think about it, there are these heroes who are flawed. They have fantastical powers, they're combating evil, but they're flawed. And they're flawed so that we can see ourselves in them. But they also embody the best human qualities. These superheroes, they aim for the highest good, and they're a net force for positive change. They get it wrong in the details, but they're moving at least in the right direction. And these are the heroes that we can relate to best because we know we too are flawed. But we also want to strive for the highest good, or at least we like the idea of aiming for the highest good, even if we're not particularly motivated to do so. So as a chaplain, I meet with a lot of people from diverse walks of life. Some are religious, some are spiritual, and some have no connection at all with spirituality. And that's okay. My role within the military is not to proselytize. I don't. It's not my job to convert people to my particular faith tradition. But rather, my role is to accompany people on their journey, their life story. And people come to see a padre or a chaplain for a variety of reasons. They could be wrestling with issues of faith or religion. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they're struggling with an issue or situation. Maybe they're experiencing a crisis such as the death of a loved one or separation or divorce, or maybe issues related to work. But regardless of a person's faith tradition or faith background or spirituality or even no faith, there are 4 practices that I have found helpful when dealing with the stress and trauma in our lives. So here they are. This is the takeaway. First one is expressing gratitude. Okay. The second one is seeking joy. The third one is building and maintaining healthy relationships. In other words, building community around yourselves. And the fourth one is asking for help. Now, I mentioned my faith tradition. I'm a Christian, a Protestant, a Presbyterian. So these 4 practices are filtered through the lens of Christ. That's how I see the world, because my worldview is colored by this lens. And it'll be the same for everyone else, right? So, for example, if I'm expressing gratitude, well, I'm giving thanks to God for the goodness that has come into the world through the people around me. And if I'm seeking joy, I'm asking God's Spirit to fill me with it. So this is my particular way. But when I share these principles, they apply regardless of any person's background. Okay, let's talk about expressing gratitude. There's a lot of literature out there now that talks about the benefits of expressing gratitude. And it serves at least 2 purposes that I can think of. The first is that calling to mind that for which we can be thankful reminds us of the good that we have in our lives. Okay? Calling to mind what can be thankful reminds us of the good that is in our lives. And this is a good thing, calling to mind to remembering, because by human nature, we tend to forget. We tend to forget, if I were to ask how many people remember what they had for lunch yesterday, I bet you half of us would probably struggle, right? In the same way, we tend to take for granted the goodness that comes into our lives. You could say that we even become habitualized by it. It's like having a beautiful painting on your wall. Now, maybe for the first few weeks, you take time to look at it every day and you admire the colors, you admire the details, the skill of the painter, and it brings you pleasure to look at it. But then over time, the painting fades into the background and you begin to hardly notice it at all. The painting is still just as beautiful as the day you bought it, but you've become conditioned to seeing the painting in the same spot every day, and it no longer draws your eyes. So I'd suggest that a good practice to develop is to spend time every day thinking about people, your lives, relationships, events, things that you can be grateful for. And some people do this by having a gratitude journal. And this works because it makes it more concrete, because you're writing it down. And then it acts as a diary, because then you can look back to help you remember. Okay, you might ask, all right, that's great, Andrew, but why is this important? How is this helpful? Well, being reminded of the good that is in our lives can serve as a kind of counterweight to the burdens that we carry around when they become too heavy. It kind of acts as if like an antidote to the toxicity of negativity. But it can also help provide us perspective. And perspective can help us reframe our thinking. I know in my own life, giving thanks and expressing gratitude has helped me square up with the challenges and obstacles that I faced. Here's the second one, seeking joy. Now, joy sounds a lot like happiness, but I want to say that there's some important distinctions. Happiness is is an outward expression that tends to be externally triggered by events, things, or places, or thoughts, or people, right? It's not something that we feel all the time. But joy is more consistent, and it's something that we cultivate internally. Joy is a state of being, and it comes when you make peace with who you are, why you are, and how you are. It endures hardships, trials, and it connects you with meaning and purpose. We experience happiness in our lives when circumstances are agreeable, but we can choose to live by joy no matter what's going on in our lives. It's challenging. It takes time to cultivate, but it's worth your while. Now, I'd argue that many people have lost joy in their lives because they don't know how to cultivate it. So they look for quick fixes and distractions such as, addictive foods or too much alcohol or maybe compulsive shopping or even excessive busyness. Or we seek those happy feelings by watching television, for example. I'm sure that we can all think of movies that have brought us to tears or feelings of elation or happiness, because that's what good storytelling does. But the problem with this is it's not our story. So how do we cultivate joy and create our story? Well, one good concrete example is this: do good for others. Studies have shown that when we do good for others, the areas in our brain associated with pleasure, like sex or eating good food, they light up like a Christmas tree. It triggers a dopamine response. And we are participating in our own story rather than merely watching a movie or a TV show play out on the screen. Doing good gives meaning and purpose to your story, and it brings joy to your life. And that actually leads me to my third point: establishing and maintaining healthy relationships or building community around yourself. People who devote time to their family, their friends, and nurture and enjoy their relationships tend to be happy and contented people. They're less likely to have physical and mental health problems. They are better at regulating their emotions when faced with stress and difficult situations. Healthy relationships can increase your sense of worth and belonging and help you feel less alone. And do you know what you're doing when you do this? You're actually cultivating a joy-filled life. So if you want to seek joy, if you want to build community, do some good from someone else. And that's how the happiness happens. So consequently, I would encourage people to focus on having a network of social support with a variety of different types of relationships, from romantic to friendship to associate, in order to hold up your well-being and quality of life. My wife has observed that I've become more intentional about building relationships as I've gotten older. For a long time, I didn't really think that it was, all that important. I had some friends and I was satisfied. But she noted that I've been able to be more vulnerable about my needs and then do something about it as I've gotten older. And she's right. I came to the conclusion a few years ago that, I need more friends. I need more acquaintances, because I believe that we're built for relationships, and I just didn't have enough in my life. So I decided to spread the net a little wider, and now my circle's bigger. Not a lot bigger, but bigger. So here's the fourth point: asking for help. There's this wonderful story in the Bible where the disciples are on a boat in the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus is in the boat with them, and he's asleep on a cushion. And while the disciples are out on this sea, this lake, a storm blows in. Now, the disciples try to row themselves out of this storm. They try to row themselves to the safety of shore. But when they can't do it because they don't have the strength and the storm is too strong, and they realize that they're going to drown, they finally ask Jesus for help, but only because they've run out of options. Now, isn't it ironic that when the disciples needed help and the help was right there in the boat with them, they didn't access it or even recognize it. But isn't it just like us to do that? Isn't it human nature to think that we can always rescue ourselves without any assistance? Either because we're too proud, or haven't normalized the practice, or we're just oblivious. We just don't know that it is there. I've learned over the years that when I need help, there's no shame in asking. And the sooner I ask, the better, because I've also learned over the years that the longer I wait to ask for help, the more a problem will compound and require even greater resources to resolve. So, in conclusion, it was important for me to assign meaning to the events in Afghanistan in a way that made sense to me. I wanted to be able to remember, but not be crushed when I remembered. There were a lot of people who were impacted by that friendly fire incident, but not everyone dealt with it in the same way, nor arrived at the same conclusion. I had to deal with it and make sense of it in a way that seemed appropriate to me. And this is hard to do when a seemingly random event, which was completely preventable, and yet it happened and caused considerable damage to many people in the aftermath. I can't change what happened that night. I survived, for others didn't. Challenged my faith, my values, my ability to see goodness in other people. But yet it was my spiritual practices that kept me going in those dark moments. My belief in the goodness of God has nourished and sustained me, and I've been surrounded by supportive and loving people. Being intentional about these practices has helped me find meaning in my life. It's not a magic cure, though. Seeking optimal health doesn't mean being injury or trauma-free. It just means the wounds I carry with me have healed and I now bear scars. I wish I could wave a magic wand and change what happened that night, but I can't. What's done is done. But what I wouldn't change is how I have grown as a result. I am a stronger, more well-rounded person now. I believe that I've done a good job of internalizing the lessons that I've learned. I have greater empathy and compassion as a person, and I am a better person for it. So what was my solution to recognizing the tragedy of their deaths? Well, here it is. I have tried to live a life that honors their sacrifice. I aim for the highest good, even though I often miss the mark. And I try to walk uphill to face life's challenges, even when I stumble. I try to be a net force for good, even if I make mistakes in the details. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time, everyone.
Thank you, Andrew, for sharing your story and your wisdom and reminding how to foster spiritual in our own life. Does anybody have any questions at all for Andrew? Go ahead.
Is that being taped?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah.
I have a question, Andrew. How do you get your message through to the troops? Do you wait for them to come to you, or are you able to proactively speak with them? And what are some of the challenges that in your day?
Well, that's a good question. So as chaplains, we're frequently among the soldiers. I mean, what we like to call ministry of presence or loitering with intent. And as you build trust with those people that you work with, you have an opportunity to get to know people. And if you linger long enough, frequently they will open up to you and share with you whatever it is they're struggling with. They'll invite you into that sacred space of their inner lives. And it's a profound privilege to be invited into that space. And it allows us to talk about whatever it is they need to get off their chest or vent about, or whatever they're seeking help for. And, in those moments, it's about them. It's about listening with compassion and empathy. So, regardless of my faith tradition or their faith tradition, we're all human beings and we all struggle with things. So, yeah, that's my answer. You had a part 2 to that question, though. What was the second part of that question?
What are the challenges that you face in your day-to-day job?
The challenges, yeah. Well, I guess that would depend on your environment. Really, it's about building those relationships and connections. If you don't build those connections, then the people you serve aren't going to connect with you, and it'll make your job harder. So really, it is about building connections and relationships, truly.
Joe has a question.
Padre, thanks very much. Great delivery. You mentioned the 4 forms: physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, physical, and spiritual.
Yeah.
Have you found that sometimes they conflict, or more often do they converge, and is there symmetry and synergy? I'm highly rational, and I would tend to put spirituality at the bottom if I were to prioritize them.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to say, look, re-rank them, not in hierarchy, but in some other model, so that they work together and it's flanking fire supporting as opposed to something other. Can you speak to either the synergy or the antithesis of synergy in these 4 forms? Particular, forget about physical, but the other 3 that are more mental. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I would say those domains in your life, move them towards the center, get them to overlap so that you're optimally healthy, mentally speaking, right? I think they're interconnected in the sense that you're building, well, let's say a building. If you're missing parts of the building's not going to be complete. So for the elements that would be missing, let's say if the spiritual dimension is atrophied, well, there's going to be some holes in your life, and you're not going to be fully optimized in a way that perhaps you could be. So I think it's an area that we often neglect, especially now, and especially this century. As I said, there's a lot of reasons why we don't practice this, and I think culture has a big part of it. But I think it is my belief that we all have a spiritual dimension. And, and what I say to people when I talk about this is I would encourage them to engage in that. I mean, find what works for you. There are a variety of things you can try. I mean, there are some good books out there, and there's some good practices like the 4 that I mentioned. And you might be surprised what happens.
I don't like surprises, not even at Christmas. Not even at Christmas.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
I have another question, Andrew. How relevant is the chaplaincy in the Canadian Forces right now? You and I have talked about there's a bit of a political threat to the chaplaincy. And do you find any of that seeps into the culture?
Well, in terms of relevancy, I would say we're more relevant now than ever. And this continues to get affirmed again and again, and from a variety of sources. There's always going to be some friction at the edges, but that's just the way it is in society. So, we all try to do our best, and I do believe that we're a positive force, and we do make a difference. Yeah.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Kent.
Thank you very much. Terrific presentation. And it made me think that when you speak of resiliency, that resiliency is really a proactive state. a state that you're in prior to some type of trauma that allows you to get back to your normal state again after the trauma. What do you do for those people who are not in a really good, resilient, spiritually resilient state before the trauma to try and get them back to normal?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's always better to be trained up instead of having to apply the medicine afterwards. Everyone's got to start from somewhere. And I mean, you take the example of the recruit school. I mean, there are some young people that arrive that are already traumatized by their life experiences. And I mean, what can you do in the middle of training? You don't have a whole lot of time to spend with them. So it's important to start putting those practices into practice, right? But I think it's also equally important to get help for any of the trauma, that unresolved trauma that might be going on in your life, right? And that's whether it's psychological or emotional trauma as well as spiritual trauma. And I think the starting point really could be, take the 4 points that I gave, start working on those and see where it leads you. I think that would really be a good starting point. And of course, the fourth point, seeking help, is always an important one anyway.
So to follow on with Joe's perspective, if we're looking at physical resilience and you break your leg and you had a weak leg to start with, there are all kinds of exercises after the fact to get your leg back to normal. What would those spiritual exercises look like?
Okay, well, meditation's a good one. Prayer is also a good one. But again, I mean, if you go back to the other points there, right? We practice expressing gratitude. That can be a daily exercise to let's say, make the leg heal, right? To build yourself up. Especially if someone's been victimized, right? Because then there's a lot that goes with that. And people, need varying degrees of help. And you've got to start somewhere. And, in my own life, I pray, I try to do good. Like I follow the 4 things that I've talked about today, but I mean, my spiritual practices are bigger than that as a Christian as well. I chose 4 that are easy to explain and share. But that would be a conversation to have one-on-one to see where you're at actually, so I could actually tailor the answer to you specifically. That would be the good answer, I think.
Well, you did a very good answer, and it was kind of a rhetorical question, because in my mind, I would say that I would try and use those other 3 quadrants to elevate that 4th one. So if the person was very physically strong, work that and try and use that as a catalyst, especially emotionally. If for any type of resilience, if you can get someone into a good attitude and feeling happy, they're going to recover better. So
absolutely,
some of those things together. But I wanted your point of view, and it was a great answer. Thank you very much.
Right on. Well, you're welcome.
Padre, my name is David Scandard. I'm on Vancouver Island. I'm tuning in. I'm in Old Strathcona. I'm involved with an organization called OSIS here on in the Lower Mainland and then over on the island here. And I think that what you've said today is very poignant and reinforces some of the activities that go on within that structure. And thank you very much for what you said today. It was very, very informative. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. I have fond memories of the Strats. When I was in Edmonton on the base there, I actually owned horses. So the Saddle Club shares the facilities with the Strats. So I got to know a few of them fairly well.
Very civilized for a Patricia.
That's right.
I'm Lloyd Northcott. I'm an Anglican priest.
Hi, Lloyd.
I think you're my favorite chaplain already.
Well,
I wonder, there's part, the sacrament of reconciliation, and confession and that
Yes.
type of, and the secrets of the confessional. I've certainly received confessions which by law I was supposed to report on, and I've never done that.
Mm.
Always felt that I was helping better by being a good listener, not approving,
Yeah.
but understanding our common humanity. So I'd be interested in your comments on our responsibility as clergy to give God's blessing to people, not necessarily approving their actions, but being there for them. Have you anything to say about that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a deep theological question. Well, I would say, because I'm going to focus in on what you said, not necessarily approving. Right. I mean, because people make decisions that we don't approve or agree with all the time. And yet, we need to find a way to connect with people in our role as chaplains or as clergy, right? Or shepherding a flock, for example, to use the Christian language, or ministering to the needs of the people that you serve in the military setting. You've got to find a way to accompany people that resonates with the other person in order to be trusted. It doesn't mean you necessarily approve of their actions, but if you're going to serve them and serve them well, it's important to find a way to, connect with them. And I think that can be grounded in our humanity, regardless of our background. And, expressing, naming it, the good where you see it, right? I think that would help a person. You can connect with them. And I think that comes with listening and listening deeply and having compassion and empathy. That will win a person's trust. And I think there you'll find goodness, even if you don't agree with necessarily a person's course of actions. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yeah, you're still my favorite.
Well, is there any other questions?
I think that you've gained some friends here today, Andrew, and thank you so much for taking the time. Andrew is in Nova Scotia right now, correct? Nova Scotia? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in Digby, Nova Scotia on a week of hunting. I'm on a hunting trip right now.
Where did you go yesterday?
So I before we conclude, so I talked about one of my points about building community and relationships. So in attendance here, my dad is here, my wife is here. I've got a colleague here, Dave Gotkin, and I've got one of my best friends, Mel. So I'm surrounded by friends and community, even here.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. I think we all really, really enjoyed the time we spent with you today. Thank you for sharing this.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
All right. Well, that concludes the formal part of our program, and you're welcome to enjoy what's left of lunch. And the bar is open until 1 o'clock. Is that right, Anna? I think it's 1 o'clock. Yes. So thank you all on Zoom, and thank you to our audience in person. And don't forget to tune in on November the 29th for Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Grotwell. We haven't met him yet, but he's going to be talking about cross-cultural literacy in peacekeeping. So that'll be very interesting. That'll be an evening presentation. So tune in for that, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.